This video will show you how to refit a piston and crankshaft into an engine block.
We will show you the set procedures, highlight key points, and show you the measurements to complete this task.
You'll complete these steps once you have stripped your engine and looked for any potential faults.
Firstly, as with all jobs, is health and safety. You need to either use barrier cream or wear gloves. This is to prevent skin infections such as dermatitis.
For the refit, you will need the following components: crankshaft, caps and bolts, bearing shells, thrust washers, DTI gauge, and ring compressor.
The first step in this procedure is to fit the bearing shells and thrust washers into the engine block. It is important that you lubricate the end of the shells and fit them in the correct order.
You would then put the crankshaft in place. You now need to spin the crankshaft in the engine block.
We now need to lubricate the other half of the shells and place them on the crank carrier or bearing caps, depending on what engine you are working on.
Place the caps on the crank and tighten to the correct sequence. You need to make sure the bearing caps are in the correct order and should always check with the manufacturer's specifications for the correct torque settings and sequence.
Next, you need to spin the crank by hand to check for bearing nip, as it is important that the crankshaft spins freely. Then check the end float with the DTI gauge. To do this, you need to preload the DTI gauge, zero it, then measure. You should check the float specifications with the manufacturer's specifications.
Before installing the pistons, you need to check that the ring gaps are 120 degrees apart, as shown on the diagram.
Slowly slide the pistons into the cylinder using the ring compressor.
Check the big end of the piston doesn't damage the crankshaft and tighten big end caps onto the bearings into the correct torque.
Spin the crank to check that the engine turns freely and you have the correct bearing nip.
Finally, you will repeat the steps to fit the remaining pistons.
Your engine block is now fitted with the components. You're ready to move on to the next procedure.